I watched through the rain as my wife kissed my boss on the porch of the house I'd built. My suitcase sat in the mud beside me, and her voice echoed through the open door. She laughed, saying, "Real men don't cry like babies." Then she closed the door, locking me out of my own life. My name is David Martinez, 42 years old, project manager at a construction firm in Denver, until last month. I'd worked for the company 12 years, loyal to a fault, building neighborhoods from blueprints to rooftops. My boss, Carl Benson, had been a mentor once. Then he became something else. I'd noticed the signs for months, the late-night texts, the perfume that wasn't hers, the sudden interest in working late. But when you love someone, you invent reasons to stay blind. Until the night I came home early from a site inspection and found Carl's jacket on the chair by our bed. The divorce was swift and brutal. She kept the house, the savings, and, through Carl's influence, even managed to get me laid off for restructuring. My name vanished from every project I'd built. Overnight, I went from respected manager to nobody. For the first few weeks, I slept in cheap motels. Then the money ran out. I ended up in my car, a faded gray pickup I'd bought years ago with my first bonus. I parked behind an abandoned gas station on the edge of town. The nights were cold, the silence heavier than any deployment. People passed me on the street without seeing me. Each morning, I'd wash up in public restrooms, looking at a man I barely recognized. My wedding ring still left a pale circle on my skin. I kept it in the glove compartment next to my discharge papers and a worn photo of my parents. It had been 3 months since I'd lost everything when it happened. I was parked outside a diner, drinking stale coffee from a paper cup, when an elderly woman in a blue coat tapped on my window. She asked softly, "Are you David Martinez?" I said yes, cautious. She smiled faintly. "Your grandfather in California left you his estate, a mansion, a Mercedes, 2 yachts, and about $300 million. But to claim it," she paused, "you must find the secret your family buried 50 years ago." I stared at her, the cup trembling in my hand. For the first time in months, I didn't feel numb. I felt the beginning of something, like the wind changing before a storm. At first, I thought she was confused. A prank, maybe. No one in my family had money, let alone $300 million. My grandfather died before I was born, a name whispered in family arguments but never discussed. Still, something about the woman's eyes held weight. Calm, steady, certain. She handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Everything you need is inside." Then she walked away before I could ask another word. Inside the envelope was a single letter, written in neat cursive on yellowed stationery. It began, "To my grandson David. If you're reading this, it means time has done what distance could not. You've reached the moment where truth can no longer be buried." There was an address in Santa Barbara, California, and a key taped to the bottom corner. No explanation, no map, just a date in faded ink, June 17th, 1974, the year my father was born. I sat in my truck for an hour, staring at that key. 3 months earlier, I'd been a man with a house, a wife, a job, and a plan. Now I was a ghost with nothing but a key to a life I didn't know existed. That night, I drove west. No destination beyond the address on the letter. The further I got from Denver, the lighter I felt. Like every mile peeled away a layer of shame. The betrayal, the mockery, the nights I'd slept in parking lots, it all started to dissolve under the hum of the highway. By the time I reached California, the sun was rising over the Pacific, painting the sky in red and gold. The address led to a long, winding road lined with eucalyptus trees. At the end stood an old Spanish-style mansion, cracked and faded but still magnificent. I parked in front of rusted gates, the key cold in my hand. A caretaker appeared from a small building near the entrance. He looked at me like he'd been waiting for years. He asked, "You're David, aren't you?" I nodded slowly. He said my grandfather had left strict instructions. No one was to enter the main house until a Martinez heir arrived in person. As the gate creaked open, a chill ran through me. The air felt heavy, electric, almost alive. I didn't know what secret my family had buried, but as I crossed that threshold, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever waited inside was going to change everything. The caretaker's name was Elias. Thin, gray-haired, and quiet in a way that made you want to listen when he finally spoke. He led me down a gravel path toward the mansion. The building loomed like something out of time. Arched windows, ivy creeping along the walls, and a cracked fountain in the center courtyard that hadn't flowed in decades. Elias said my grandfather had lived here alone for years before passing in the late 90s. The estate had remained untouched ever since. He unlocked the front door, and the hinges groaned as if they hadn't moved in a lifetime. Dust filled the air, thick and heavy, carrying the scent of cedar and salt. Inside, sunlight sliced through stained glass, throwing patterns of color across the floor. The furniture was covered with white sheets, frozen in place like ghosts of another era. Elias handed me a second envelope sealed with wax. He said it had been left for me specifically, and that once I read it, I'd understand why no one else had ever been allowed to enter. Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. The envelope contained a handwritten note and an old photograph. The photo showed my grandfather standing beside another man, both in military uniforms, smiling, arms around each other. On the back, written in faded ink, were 4 words, "The truth lies beneath." The letter was short. It said that everything the Martinez family owned, every fortune, every secret, was built on something that had to stay buried. My grandfather warned that the inheritance was conditional. Before claiming it, I had to uncover what happened in 1974. He called it the year the promise was broken. I wandered the mansion for hours, searching for meaning in the details. There were rooms locked from the inside, shelves filled with ledgers in Spanish, and a study with floorboards that creaked under uneven weight. In the office, I found a small safe embedded in the wall behind a portrait. The key I'd brought fit perfectly, but when I turned it, nothing happened. The mechanism jammed halfway. Frustrated, I stepped back. That was when I noticed something strange. The portrait above the safe wasn't just dusty. It was smeared, as if someone had touched it repeatedly with their hands. In the corner of the canvas, faint letters were scratched into the paint. They spelled a single word, bajo. I didn't speak much Spanish, but I knew enough to translate. Bajo. Under. Whatever secret my grandfather had buried, it wasn't in the walls. It was below them. That night, the mansion felt alive. The wind rattled the shutters, and the floorboards creaked like someone was walking in the next room. I slept on an old couch in the study, the portrait still hanging above the half-opened safe. I couldn't stop thinking about that one word, bajo. Under. At sunrise, I began searching the lower floors. The basement door was locked from the outside with a thick chain. I used a crowbar I'd found in the garage to pry it open. The air below was stale and cold, smelling faintly of earth and salt. My flashlight beam caught the outlines of old wine racks, tool chests, and dusty crates labeled in Spanish. Some of them bore the name Martinez Importations, a company I'd never heard of. In the far corner, behind a rotting wooden cabinet, I found a set of concrete stairs leading deeper underground. The steps were narrow, uneven, and damp. Each one groaned under my weight. At the bottom, I reached a heavy metal door with a faded military insignia painted across it. My pulse quickened. The door was rusted shut, but after several minutes of effort, it gave way. Inside was a small room, no bigger than a storage closet. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets and stacks of wooden crates stamped with export markings. One crate had been pried open, revealing dozens of small velvet pouches filled with coins. Gold coins. But it wasn't the gold that caught my attention. It was the stack of folders on a desk in the corner. Each file had the same date, June 17, 1974. Inside were government documents written in Spanish and English, stamped with classified markings. They detailed something called Operation Bajo Sol, a military trade deal between American officials and private contractors in South America. My grandfather's name appeared in several memos, alongside signatures from powerful people. It seemed the Martinez fortune wasn't born from inheritance. It was built on something far darker, a transaction that was meant to stay buried forever. Suddenly, I understood why the safe upstairs wouldn't open. The truth wasn't in the house. The safe was only a marker, a distraction. The real secret had been entombed beneath the mansion for 50 years, locked away with the past my family pretended never happened. I looked around the room, heart pounding. There were at least 20 unopened crates, each marked with the same code, B.S.-74. Whatever my grandfather had done, he'd left the evidence for me to find. The question now wasn't whether I could claim the inheritance, it was whether I wanted to. I spent the next several days cataloging everything in that underground room. It felt less like a cellar and more like a vault, a place meant to guard not treasure, but guilt. Every folder, every file, pointed to the same conclusion. My grandfather had been part of something buried deep in both history and conscience. From what I could piece together, Operation Bajo Sol had been a covert transfer of resources during the Cold War. Shipments of gold, art, and priceless relics had moved through private channels under government protection. Some of it was meant for trade. Some of it was never supposed to exist at all. And somehow, part of it had ended up here, in the hands of the Martinez family. At night, I'd sit in the study, staring at the ocean through cracked windows, trying to decide what to do. Elias brought food quietly, said nothing unless spoken to. But one morning, I caught him watching me differently, as if he knew what I'd found. When I asked how long he'd worked here, he said, "Since before your father was born." Then he added something that stuck with me. "The truth doesn't rest easy, Mr. Martinez. Your grandfather learned that too late." I returned to the cellar that afternoon and opened one of the smaller crates. Inside were framed documents sealed in glass, along with a photograph of a group of men standing beside a cargo ship. My grandfather was there again, younger, his expression unreadable. Behind him, stamped on the ship's hull, were the same initials I'd seen everywhere, B.S.-74. I searched through the drawers until I found a leather-bound ledger. Its final entry stopped me cold. It read, "Shipment buried under Soul House. Promise kept. Debt unpaid." There was no Soul House listed anywhere on the property records, but when I checked the estate map hanging in the main hall, I noticed something odd. A section of land fenced off near the cliffs, labeled simply as Solar Grounds. That night, I followed a narrow trail leading to that part of the property. The ocean roared below, waves crashing against the rocks. In the moonlight, I saw a concrete foundation half hidden by vines and sand. It looked like the remains of another building, one that had long since been destroyed. When I brushed away the dirt, faint letters appeared on the cracked wall. SOL House. The air turned colder, heavier. That was when I realized the secret wasn't just about money or power. Something had been buried here, literally, and my family had spent 50 years keeping it silent. By morning, I was already digging. The soil near the old foundation was loose, recently disturbed compared to the rest of the ground. Someone had been here before, someone who hadn't finished what they started. I worked for hours, my hands raw, the ocean wind cutting across my face. Then, just before noon, the shovel hit metal. I brushed away the dirt to reveal a rusted steel hatch, about the size of a door. Its handle was fused shut with corrosion, but a pry bar from the tool shed finally cracked it open. A rush of stale air escaped, thick with the smell of salt and decay. I lowered a flashlight into the darkness. A narrow staircase led downward into a chamber that didn't appear on any of the property blueprints. The space below was small, circular, and lined with stone. At the center stood a large wooden chest, its lid carved with the same initials I'd seen in the documents, B.S.-74. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready for what might be inside. When I finally lifted the lid, the light caught on something unexpected. Not gold, not jewels, but documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth, along with several sealed vials and a small, tarnished cross. The papers were fragile but legible. They weren't business contracts. They were confessions, written statements, witness accounts, and ledgers listing shipments of artifacts taken from war-torn regions. Paintings, religious relics, and minerals with unknown origins. Every item cataloged and moved under government contracts. My grandfather's signature appeared again and again, verifying each delivery. But one entry stood apart. It was dated June 17, 1974, the same date from his letter. The note beside it read, "One shipment lost. No recovery. No witnesses." I turned over the final page and froze. A faded photograph was paperclipped to it, an aerial image of this very coastline. In the picture, there were two buildings, not one. The second, long gone, stood where I'd been digging. The caption beneath it said, "Soul Research Annex, Restricted." I realized then that my family hadn't just hidden stolen goods. They'd hidden something more dangerous, something that had required a facility to contain it. Whatever had been lost in 1974 hadn't just vanished. It had been buried right here. I looked around the chamber, my flashlight flickering. The waves above grew louder, crashing against the rocks. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt like I wasn't alone down there. The air inside that chamber grew heavier the longer I stood there. My flashlight dimmed again, flickering against the stone walls like it was reacting to something unseen. I shut it off for a moment, listening. There was no wind, no ocean noise, just a faint hum, low, constant, mechanical. I followed it to the back of the room, where a metal panel jutted out from the wall. It looked newer than everything else around it. When I pried it open, I found a hidden compartment lined with lead. Inside, a single object rested on a steel pedestal, a rectangular metal case with warning symbols etched into it. The words "Property of Sol Annex" were burned into the side. Beneath them, in smaller text, "Handle with caution, unstable compound." I didn't touch it. Instead, I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever my grandfather had buried, it wasn't just gold or secrets. It was something he didn't want the world to find. Something dangerous enough to be sealed underground for half a century. I climbed out of the hatch, sealing it behind me. The ocean air felt colder than before. Elias was waiting at the top of the hill, his face pale, his eyes fixed on me like he already knew. When I asked if he was aware of what lay beneath the solar grounds, he said only this: "Your grandfather made a choice that saved lives, but it came at a cost none of us understood." Then he turned and walked back toward the mansion. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the study, staring at the old portrait above the safe. Every secret I'd uncovered led to another layer, another unanswered question. Why had my grandfather written that letter to me? Why now? And what did he mean by the promise was broken? Around midnight, I finally returned to the cellar and opened the metal case I'd found earlier among the crates. Inside was a sealed envelope labeled to be opened only by blood. My name was written beneath it in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a single page and a photograph of him standing beside a younger man, my father. The note read, "David, if you are reading this, it means the past has found you. What we buried under Soul House wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to be protected until someone strong enough to face it came along." Beneath the message, 3 coordinates were written. Not for this property, but somewhere farther north along the coast. Whatever this inheritance truly was, it wasn't money. It was a mission, and I had just been drafted into it. At dawn, I packed a small bag, locked the mansion, and started driving north. The coordinates from my grandfather's letter led to a remote stretch of coastline near Big Sur, miles of cliffs, fog, and ocean mist that swallowed the horizon. The drive took 6 hours, and every mile felt heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was heading toward, but something in me needed to see it through. The road ended near an abandoned naval outpost. Faded warning signs still hung along the fence. Radiation hazard, restricted zone, property of the U.S. government. The place looked deserted, but the coordinates pointed directly beyond it, toward the cliffs. I parked, grabbed my flashlight, and followed a path through the fog. The trail wound down to a narrow plateau overlooking the sea. There, hidden among the rocks, was a concrete bunker entrance. The door was half buried under soil and moss, the metal corroded by decades of salt air. I cleared the debris and found the same insignia I'd seen before, Sol Annex inside. The air was thick, metallic. The bunker stretched deep into the earth, lined with rusted pipes and flickering light fixtures. Most of the rooms were empty except for collapsed furniture and old filing cabinets. But at the far end, I found another sealed chamber, its door reinforced with steel, a keypad beside it. The code plate was shattered, but someone had carved numbers into the wall nearby, 061774. I punched them in. The lock released with a hiss. The room inside was smaller than I expected, bare concrete walls, a single desk, and a long metal container in the center covered with a canvas sheet. The hum I'd heard in the mansion was there again, faint but unmistakable. I pulled back the canvas, expecting documents or relics. Instead, I found a cryogenic capsule. The glass was cracked, but inside, preserved in frozen mist, lay a small metallic core the size of a football, pulsing faintly with light. It wasn't human remains. It wasn't treasure. It was technology, something foreign, advanced, and alive. Taped to the side of the capsule was another note, sealed in plastic. It said, "Property of Project Soul. Keep contained. Never activate." I stepped back, heart racing. Whatever my grandfather had hidden, it wasn't just a secret, it was a warning. And now, 50 years later, that warning had just been opened. I stood there, staring at the faint pulse of light through the cracked glass. It flickered rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to respond, brightening, dimming, almost aware. I backed away slowly, but every instinct I had told me it was already too late. On the wall near the capsule was a faded control panel. Most of the switches were corroded, but one small monitor still blinked faintly. I brushed away the dust, and letters began to form across the screen. System reboot initiated. Then a sequence of numbers scrolled by, too fast to read. The hum in the room deepened to a low vibration that I could feel through the floor. I hit the emergency power switch beside the door, but the system didn't stop. The capsule's glow intensified, filling the room with white light. Then, as suddenly as it began, it went dark. Silence. The hum was gone. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I saw it. The metallic core inside had split open slightly, revealing something crystalline within, almost like a small sphere suspended in glass. The air felt charged, buzzing against my skin. I reached for my phone to record it, but the screen went black the moment I pointed it toward the object. Dead battery. I decided to leave. I closed the chamber door and climbed the tunnel back toward the cliffs, the smell of salt air growing stronger with each step. When I finally reached daylight, the wind hit me hard, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I drove back toward the mansion without looking back. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, but my mind was clear for the first time since all this began. My grandfather hadn't buried a secret for greed or guilt. He'd buried it to contain something beyond understanding, something powerful enough to outlive him. When I arrived, Elias was waiting outside the gate, as if he'd known I'd return. His expression was grim. Before I could speak, he said quietly, "You opened it, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but he looked at me like the silence was enough. He told me that my grandfather had spent his final years watching the horizon, waiting for signs that the world would rediscover what he had hidden. He used to say, Elias whispered, that every generation buries its sins until one man digs them up. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pulse of that light, faint but alive, as if it was still calling me back. The next morning, I woke to the sound of waves breaking harder against the cliffs. The sky outside the mansion was gray and restless, the kind of weather that feels like a warning. I made coffee in the old kitchen, but the power flickered twice before cutting out completely. The generator hadn't failed since I arrived. It felt deliberate, like something was drawing energy away from the house. Elias was gone. His room was empty, his car missing. The only thing he'd left behind was a note on the table. It said, "The inheritance was never meant to be claimed. Leave before it claims you." I packed my things fast. I should have driven straight back to Denver, but I couldn't. Not without knowing what that thing really was. Every instinct told me to walk away, but the soldier in me needed closure. The kind that only comes when you finish what you start. By noon, I was back at the bunker. The fog was thicker now, rolling across the cliffs like smoke. Inside, the air was colder. The hum had returned, louder than before, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat buried in stone. The sealed chamber's door was wide open. The capsule was empty. The metallic case lay shattered on the floor, frost spreading outward from its edges. In the center of the room, small shards of glass glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the sound. On the wall above them, a single phrase had been scrawled in the dust, letters burned into the concrete. "The promise is broken." I backed away slowly, the temperature dropping with each step. My breath came out in clouds. Then I saw a movement, a flash of light, like static, crawling across the floor before vanishing into the cracks. It wasn't fire, not electricity. It was something else entirely, something alive. I left the bunker and didn't look back. By the time I reached my truck, the wind had turned violent, scattering sand across the cliffs. When I glanced toward the sea, the horizon shimmered faintly, as if the ocean itself had caught the same light. I drove until nightfall, stopping at a roadside motel miles inland. The mansion, the bunker, the legacy, all of it felt like a dream I'd woken from too late. Before I turned off the light, I checked my phone. For the first time in days, it powered on. There was a single unread message. No number, no origin, just 3 words glowing against the screen. It's not buried. I stared at it for a long time, listening to the faint hum still echoing in my head. Whatever my grandfather had hidden, it was awake now. And whether I liked it or not, it carried my name. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.